Welcome. I am Michael Shermer, the director of the Skeptic Society and the publisher of Skeptic magazine, the quarterly magazine of the society that investigates claims of the paranormal, pseudoscience, fringe groups, and cults and claims of all kinds between science, non-science, voodoo science, junk science, pathological science, and plain old nonsense. If you would like to join the Skeptic Society and get the magazine and learn the secret handshake and the secrets to the Da Vinci Code and a bunch of other stuff, you can do that today for $25 by filling out the form inside here. The eSkeptic is free, yes, but you don't get the color photo cover with the eSkeptic. Those of you who are subscribers and wondering, where's my copy of this? We just got this from the printer a couple of days ago. It's in the mail, coming from Wisconsin where our printer is, so it takes a few days. You will get it this next week or the week after that. So, we do also have this flyer over there, the beige-looking one. That's our upcoming lectures. We do these gigs. Oh, first, let me just see. How many of you are here for the first time to a Skeptic? First time. Wow, look at the first-time hands. Very good. Welcome, all of you. Now, let me see a show of hands. How many have never been here before? Let me see. All right, if you raised your hand twice, you definitely need a membership right away. It's a matter of critical thinking. We have 3 more events coming up in the next 3 months, and then you'll be getting another flyer. So make sure you're on our database to get the flyers as well. We do that on the eSkeptic also. Edward Tufte is speaking for us 2 weeks from today, December 5th. Sunday, same place, same time, on beautiful evidence. Edward Tufte essentially invented the field of the visual presentation of data. How to do it, how to not overwhelm somebody with too much data, and how to get your point across clearly. And he doesn't like PowerPoint, by the way, so he has much to say about PowerPoint. He's even published a publication on PowerPoint. The week after that, 3 weeks from today, Sunday, December 12th, we have Mike Newdow speaking and singing and whatever else he does. Those of you who are clapping know Mike Newdow is the gentleman who brought to the U.S. Supreme Court the case for taking under God out of the Pledge of Allegiance. So you should come. Mike is really quite a character. He's a medical doctor. He's a lawyer, though we won't hold that part against him. And he's a folk singer. He's actually has cut a CD singing songs about the various social issues he has undertaken, including the Pledge case. He has a hilarious bit where he recorded on his voicemail all the messages that people left him after the 9th District ruled in his favor here in California. And it's really quite funny. When you call him, you get the voicemail, and it says, if you want to leave a message for Mike, press 1. If you want to leave a curse or a nasty message, press 2. Death threats, press 3. He's at least got a sense of humor about it. So that's December 12th, and we're off for the rest of the year. And then on Sunday, January 9th, we have Jared Diamond. So don't miss that. It's going to be another terrific show. Jared is the author, as you know, of Guns, Germs, and Steel, and he has a sequel to the book called Collapse. It's about the collapse of civilizations in history due to the destruction of their environment, mainly, and how to avoid that with obvious implications for today. Jared's a terrific speaker, and he's a great mind. So that's Sunday, January 9th. We'll do an eSkeptic reminder on that. So that's largely it for the commercials. We've added a few new items of DVDs. Some of you have been after us to get DVDs from VHS tapes because the culture is in the transferring now of that. So we do have, we've added some the PBS series that I appeared on, The Question of God, Sigmund Freud, C.S. Lewis, and, is there a God or not? They spent 4 hours on it. I just said no, and that was it. But it's a good show. It's a beautifully produced show, and I don't know if this is related or not. We're also now carrying Penn and Teller's Bullshit, which is, if you don't mind the language, these are really terrific debunking shows on that. And we've added the new updated Cosmos, which is really beautiful. They've remastered it, and just before his death, Carl added a number of updated segments and so on. And of course, we have our own speaker today, Richard Dawkins. We've pre-programmed this. We know what he's going to say. We psychically, telepathically No, this is a previous lecture from 1996 on River Out of Eden. So that and our conversions to other things pretty much wraps up the commercial portion of the evening. I thought I'd go over some of the things that have been going on since we last met, which was, I don't know, roughly a month ago. Apparently the Virgin Mary has made an appearance on a cheese sandwich, now for sale on eBay. This is the American way of spirituality. I've gotten so many conflicted reports. I don't know if you have it. I heard that the last I heard it sold for like $5,100. Then I also heard that eBay simply shut it off and didn't allow any sales to go on of the cheese sandwich. And there was some dispute about how much of the cheese sandwich had been eaten. And then apparently the cheese sandwich was like 10 years old, and I don't know, and that it hadn't molded because the Virgin Mary was protecting the cheese sandwich. Anyway, it's an article in LA Times this morning on the sort of economic model, the trickle-down theory of religiosity. Why are Americans so much more religious than Europeans? One answer, I think an interesting one, is that because we have separation of church and state, we essentially have a free market of competition between religions. And they have to compete for limited customers and resources, and therefore they've gotten pretty good and effective at marketing their products and services, such as they are, and the FDA does not regulate that. So, I should note parenthetically, for those of you in the back room there who can't see us, but hopefully you can hear us okay, and if you can't hear back there in that other room, there's a little amplifier off on my right. Oh, that doesn't help, does it? Your left, and you can just turn the volume up a little bit there if it's a problem. We did try to book Beckman Auditorium, which holds quite a few more, but that was booked about 6 months ago before we even had this date. And I did call the Rose Bowl, but they said something about a Billy, what was it again? Graham, yeah, Billy. Something like 100,000. I said we would be happy to share the stage. In fact, our speaker, Richard Dawkins, is very inspirational. He gives a great testimonial about transcendency and the beauty of nature and so on. He wrote this book on the selfless gene. But somebody at the other line Googled it and said, no, that was not selfless gene. Anyway, that was the end of that. So here we are in Baxter Lecture Hall, right? So, let's see. I had a funny. I just had this suit cleaned. You like this suit? I got this sort of this green. It's a hand-painted silk tie from the Galapagos. Well, what happened was a couple years ago, somebody gave me a bullet for good luck, and I put the bullet in my chest pocket here. And last month I was at Murray State University in Kentucky. They brought me in for a little talk there. It's sort of in the Bible Belt there. And I was walking down the street, and a crazed evangelist heaved a Gideon's Bible out of the window of this hotel. And it struck me right in the chest. And it would have gone right into my heart if it weren't for the bullet that stopped it. These things are true. Some stuff I just make up, but this one. I was in Esalen Institute last week. Really, seriously. It was unbelievable. It's the place where all the, Timothy Leary and the Moody Blues and all the Uri Geller and all the psychics used to hang out. And those types still sort of hang out there, although it's kind of drug-free. Now they just adjust their chakras and get high on that. So I gave a little dose of skepticism, which was rather interesting. It's one of these things where you do this in a hot tub with clothing optional, and by God, it was clothing optional. And we were sitting there in this hot tub. It was an evolution conference, so there was real scientists there, and we were sitting. Just picture this scene: we're sitting in this hot tub, clothing optional, and this anthropologist is there explaining to everybody in the hot tub why humans are the only primates with a penis bone. Without a penis bone. I mean, it's all the other primates have a penis, but we're the only ones that. And everybody's like, yeah, what's this guy getting at? And that there was this sexual selection for that because the females don't like them. And so then that led to a discussion on whether you could have sex in a hot tub. And this anthropologist says, well, no, you can't because the heat prevents the erection. To which somebody else who was staying there said, well, that's not true. And I am an empiricist, but I think you can only take science so far. I'm sure you saw this. This is not a joke, unfortunately. In Georgia, they are now putting stickers in science textbooks, biology textbooks, saying that evolution is only a theory. Somebody wrote a funny little thing on the internet about how this should be introduced as law, in fact, nationwide. Turns out Representative Thomas Foolery introduced a bill last week outlawing gravity. If the theory, and it is just a theory, of this fellow Newton were true, he said, what would hold up heaven? The bill quickly came to a vote after proponents of a theory called intelligent suspension testified that many physicists regard Newton's theories having been superseded in the 20th century, and the administration's newly appointed science advisor pointed out that repealing gravity would allow Americans to fly to Mars much more cheaply. Anyway, so, that's right. And the cheese sandwich is 10 years old, has one bite in it, and the current bid is about $7,000 with 2 days to go. So, after this lecture, go to your laptop and log on there. The cheese sandwich. That is so American. I'll tell you another American. This is very much of a California thing. Back in the mid-'90s or so, I appeared on a number of television shows with a hypnotherapist whose specialty was alien abductions. So these people were being abducted by aliens. When did this happen? Oh, a long time ago. How do you know it happened? Because I went through a therapy, and I discovered it by going back into time through hypnosis. So this repressed memory and then recovering the lost memory. Okay? So anyway, and this was her special. Obviously, our point of view is that these memories are being coaxed out of. These are not really memories. They're fantasies that are being concocted right there in the therapy session. Anyway, so this woman, Yvonne is her name, and I did a number of these sort of back and forth on TV. Anyway, I hadn't seen her on any of these alien shows in a long time, and I ran into her it's a true story, in Pasadena here, down at this restaurant in Old Town. And I hadn't seen her in like 10 years, and I knew she lived in the area. She's not here, is she? Okay, so all right, that's good. Very nice lady. But anyway, so this is one of these California things where you're always reinventing yourself, right? So Yvonne, so what are you doing now? She says, I'm in real estate. I just thought that was too funny. The alien business dropped off. The market for real estate went up. Interest rates are down. Okay, here we go. Okay, and Pennsylvania, finally Pennsylvania, not a joke, has a law on a law trying to be passed about the required teaching of intelligent design. Okay, what's going on here? And I think this is our transition here to our speaker. And our subject for today, what's the story here? Is it just the science? What is it really science under dispute? And or is there something else? And I had a quote here from Herbert Spencer, who was a 19th century social theorist or social scientist, whatever you want to call him, sort of the inventor of sociology. Social Darwinist, certainly a big fan of Darwin. And he had this great quote that I think is very prescient. This was about a century ago he wrote this. Those who cavalierly reject the theory of evolution as not adequately supported by the facts seem quite to forget that their own theory is supported by no facts at all. And that's still true. The intelligent design theorists have no facts to present as constructive science, to present some sort of a research program from which we can move forward to find out what's going on in nature. In fact, they just pick away at the so-called gaps in science. And why are they doing that? And of course, we'll hear more about that today. But in my opinion, it really has to do with the expansion of science, and particularly evolutionary theory, into a narrative that becomes a worldview that really touches us emotionally, not just the science. I don't think these guys really care, or the fundamentalists who don't accept it. Roughly 45% of Americans, or 38% I think now, don't accept evolution at all. Why is that? It has nothing to do with the evolution of cockroaches, or they're not into the study of clades or punctuated equilibrium. It has nothing to do with that. It's the fact that we now have a fairly coherent worldview, starting from pre-Big Bang, really almost. Certainly, origins of the Big Bang is being speculated, all the way up to the origins and evolution of humans, and that starts to bump up against the worldview that religion has, for so long, thousands of years, had a monopoly on. And the better you can tell the story, the more compelling it becomes on an emotional level. And I think that's what makes certain scientists stand out above others. I think that's in part why so many people are here. It's not that Richard is such a terrific scientist, although he is, but he's an elegant storyteller, and it's telling the story of our origins and evolution that I think touches so many people. And he has certainly done that, I think, to the extent better than almost anyone else, or certainly that. So with that, I want to introduce Richard and Lalla, who will be doing about 30 minutes of co-reading out of the new book, and then followed by about 30 minutes of Q&A. So any Billy Graham followers, we welcome your input. And then we'll do the book signing afterwards. Richard will sit right over there and be happy to chat and sign books with you. Richard is born in Nairobi, Kenya, 1941, and he was educated at Oxford. He taught at UC Berkeley, so he had a taste of California, so he knows something of where he is now. Then he went back to Oxford, where he is now the Charles Simonyi Professor of the Public Understanding of Science, and boy, do we need that. Some of you may have seen Richard was voted, of the top 100 public intellectuals in England, he was number one, and number one by far, which is really saying something. He's won a number of important prizes, including the International Cosmos Prize, the Kistler Prize in 2001, where I heard his lecture there. He has honorary degrees in literature, which I think is also very appropriate, and science. And he's now a fellow of the Royal Society, which is just about the coolest thing I think you can be. Darwin had FRS after his initials, and that's pretty great. And most of you, of course, know from his previous books, The Selfish Gene, The Extended Phenotype, The Blind Watchmaker, River Out of Eden, Unweaving the Rainbow, The Devil's Chaplain, and now The Ancestor's Tale, which I just wrote a nice little bit about in Scientific American because of that thing I mentioned about it being such a great story. These creationists demand for just one transitional fossil. They're very clever about this. You know, here's a fossil, and here's a fossil, and there's a gap in the fossil record, right? And you evolutionists can't fill that gap. So you do, you know, because there's plenty of them. So when I've debated these guys, I've said, well, yeah, here's one, and I put a slide up, and they go, okay, now there's two gaps in the fossil record. That's pretty clever. It's pretty clever. The more evidence you have, the weaker your theory gets. Well, here are 673 pages of transitional fossils, convergent science and theory and data, and a magnificent story, as you will hear with Richard and his wife, the actress Lalla Ward, who is traveling with him on this tour of America as they do the readings. Please help me welcome Richard and Lalla.
Well, after a warm-up act like that, things can only get cooler. All I can contribute to the theory of gravity is the Darwinian theory of gravity. Everything that goes up has long since disappeared. And we're left only with things that go down. The Ancestor's Tale is a history of life, all 4 billion years of it. It's written backwards, starting in the present as a pilgrimage to the past to seek our ancestors. There is a rationale for doing it backwards, and it's explained in the first chapter of the book, The Conceit of Hindsight. It is a conceit of hindsight to see evolution as aimed towards some particular endpoint, such as ourselves. A historically minded swift, understandably proud of flight as self-evidently the premier accomplishment of life, might regard swift kind, those spectacular flying machines with their swept-back wings who stay aloft for a year at a time and even copulate in free flight, as the acme of evolutionary progress. To build on a fancy of Steven Pinker, if elephants could write history, They might portray tapirs, elephant shrews, elephant seals, and proboscis monkeys as tentative beginners along the main trunk road of evolution, taking the first fumbling steps, but each, for some reason, never quite making it. So near, yet so far. Elephant astronomers might wonder whether, on some other world, there exist alien life forms that have crossed the nasal Rubicon and taken the final leap to full proboscitude.
We are neither swifts nor elephants. We are people. As we wander in imagination through some long-dead geological epoch, it is humanly natural to reserve a special warmth and curiosity for whichever otherwise ordinary species in that ancient landscape is our ancestor. It's an intriguingly unfamiliar thought that there is always one such species. It is hard to deny our human temptation to see this one species as on the main line of evolution, the others a supporting cast, walk-on parts, cameos sidelined. Without succumbing to that error, there is one way to indulge a legitimate human centrism while respecting historical propriety. That way is to do our history backwards, and it is the way of this book.
The ancestor's tale is cast in the form of an epic pilgrimage from the present to the past. All roads lead to the origin of life. But because we are human, the path we shall follow will be a human pilgrimage to discover human ancestors. As we go, we shall greet other pilgrims who join us at a series of rendezvous points as we encounter the common ancestor we share with each of them.
The first fellow pilgrims we greet, some 5 million years ago, deep in Africa where Stanley memorably shook hands with Livingstone, are the chimpanzees. 1 million years further into the past, the gorillas join us, then the orangutans, next the gibbons, then monkeys, and so on until we finally greet the bacteria, after which all the pilgrims march together in one single backward quest for the origin of life itself, life's Canterbury.
Following Chaucer's lead, my pilgrims, which are all the different species of living creature, have the opportunity to tell tales along the way. It is these tales that form the main substance of the book. Incidentally, I decided it would be twee to let them tell their tales in the first person singular. And as with Chaucer's tales, they're not necessarily about the teller, but they carry a message about life or evolution in general. It's a surprising fact that there are only 39 of these rendezvous points with living pilgrims as we go back to rendezvous 39, which is where we greet the bacteria pilgrims. We're going to sample our way back through the book, through the time, through various rendezvous, beginning at rendezvous 2, maybe 7 million years into the past, where we greet the gorilla pilgrims. The gorilla's tale. The rise of Darwinism in the 19th century polarized attitudes towards the apes. Opponents who might have stomached evolution itself balked with visceral horror at cousinship with what they perceived as low and revolting brutes, and desperately tried to inflate our differences with them. This was nowhere more true than with gorillas. Apes were animals. We were set apart. Worse, where other animals, such as cats or deer, could be seen as beautiful in their own way, gorillas and other apes, precisely because of their similarity to ourselves, seemed like caricatures, distortions, grotesques.
Darwin never missed an opportunity to put the other view, sometimes in little asides, such as his charming observation in The Descent of Man that monkeys smoke tobacco with pleasure. Nowadays, scientists not only think we resemble apes, we include ourselves within the apes, specifically the African apes. We emphasize, by contrast, the distinctness of apes, including humans, from monkeys. To call a gorilla or a chimpanzee a monkey is a solecism.
It has not always been so. In former times, apes were frequently lumped with monkeys, and some of the early descriptions confused apes with baboons or with Barbary macaques, which indeed are still known as Barbary apes. More surprisingly, long before people thought in terms of evolution at all, and before apes were clearly distinguished from each other or from monkeys, great apes were frequently confused with humans. Agreeable as it would be to approve this apparent prescience of evolution, it unfortunately may owe more to racism. Early white explorers in Africa saw chimpanzees and gorillas as close kin only to black humans, not to themselves. Interestingly, tribes in both Southeast Asia and Africa have traditional legends suggesting a reversal of evolution as conventionally seen. Their local great apes are regarded as humans who fell from grace. Orangutan means man of the woods in Malay.
A picture of a so-called orangutan by the Dutch Dr. Bontius in 1658 is, in T.H. Huxley's words, nothing but a very hairy woman of rather comely aspect, and with proportions and feet wholly human. Hairy she is, except oddly in one of the few places where a real woman is. Her pubic region is conspicuously naked. Also very human are the pictures made a century later by Linnaeus's pupil Hoppius in 1763. One of his creatures has a tail, but is otherwise wholly human, bipedal, and carries a walking stick. Pliny the Elder says that the tailed species have even been known to play at checkers.
One might have thought that such a mythology would have prepared our civilization for the idea of evolution when it arrived in the 19th century, and might even have accelerated its discovery. Apparently not. Instead, the picture is one of confusion between apes, monkeys, and humans. This makes it hard to date the scientific discovery of each species of great ape, and it is often unclear which one is being discovered. The exception is the gorilla, which became known to science the most recently. In 1847, an American missionary, Dr. Thomas Savage, saw in the house of another missionary on the Gaboon River a skull represented by the natives to be a monkey-like animal, remarkable for its size, ferocity, and habits. The unjust reputation for ferocity was later to be hyperbolized in the story of King Kong. Judging from its location, Savage's species must have been the western gorilla, gorilla. The mountain gorilla was discovered, he shot it, by the German Robert von Behringer as late as 1902. As we shall see, it is now regarded as a subspecies of the eastern gorilla, and the whole eastern species now, unfairly one might think, bears his name, Gorilla beringii.
The pygmies, originally mentioned by Homer and Herodotus as a legendary race of very small humans, were later assumed by 17th and 18th century explorers to be none other than the chimpanzees then being discovered in Africa. Tyson, in 1699, shows a drawing of a pygmy, which, as Huxley says, is plainly a young chimpanzee, although it too is depicted walking upright and carrying a walking stick. Now, of course, we use the word pygmy for small humans again.
This leads us back to the racism, which until relatively late in the 20th century was endemic in our culture. Early explorers often assigned the native peoples of the forests a closer affinity with chimpanzees, gorillas, or orangs than with the explorers themselves. In the 19th century, after Darwin, evolutionists often regarded African peoples as intermediate between apes and Europeans, on the upward path to white supremacy. This is not only factually wrong, it violates a fundamental principle of evolution. Two cousins are always exactly equally related to any outgroup because they are connected to that outgroup via a shared ancestor. For reasons given in the Bonobo's tale, all humans are exactly equally close cousins to all gorillas. Racism and speciesism and our perennial confusion over how inclusively we wish to cast our moral net are brought into sharp and sometimes uncomfortable focus in the history of our attitudes to our fellow humans and our attitudes to apes, our fellow apes. We now move back to Rendezvous 10, about 75 million years ago, where we greet the rodent and rabbit pilgrims. Rendezvous 10, rodents.
Rodents are one of the great success stories of mammaldom. More than 40% of all mammal species are rodents, and there are said to be more individual rodents in the world than all other mammals combined. Rats and mice have been the hidden beneficiaries of our own agricultural revolution, and they have traveled with us across the seas to every land in the world. They devastate our granaries and our health. Rats and their cargo of fleas were responsible for the Great Plague and arguably the Black Death. They've spread typhus and have been blamed for more human deaths in the second millennium than all wars and revolutions put together. When even the 4 horsemen are laid low by the apocalypse, it will be rats that scavenge their remains, rats that will swarm over the ruins of civilization. Rats are gnawing machines. They have a pair of very prominent incisor teeth at the front, perpetually growing to replace massive wear and tear. Rodents can gnaw their way through almost anything. Most are mouse-sized, but they range up through marmots, beavers, agoutis, and maras, to the sheep-sized capybaras of the South American waterways. Capybaras are prized for meat, not just because of their large size, but because, bizarrely, the Roman Catholic Church traditionally deemed them honorary fish for Fridays. Presumably because they live in water. Large as they are, modern capybaras are dwarfed by various giant South American rodents that went extinct only quite recently. The giant capybara, Protohydrokeros, was the size of a donkey. Telecomis was an even larger rodent, the size of a small rhinoceros, which, like the giant capybara, went extinct at the time of the Great American Interchange, when the Isthmus of Panama ended South America's island status.
A world without rodents would be a very different world. It is less likely to come to pass than a world dominated by rodents and free of people. I have a post-Armageddon vision. We and all other large animals are gone. Rodents emerge as the ultimate post-human scavengers. They gnaw their way through New York, London, and Tokyo, digesting spilled larders, ghost supermarkets, and human corpses, and turning them into new generations of rats and mice whose racing populations explode out of the cities and into the countryside. When all the relics of human profligacy are eaten, populations crash again, and the rodents turn on each other and on the cockroaches scavenging with them. In a period of intense competition, short generations, perhaps with radioactively enhanced mutation rates, boost rapid evolution. With human ships and planes gone, islands become islands again, with local populations isolated, save for occasional lucky raftings, ideal conditions for evolutionary divergence. Within 5 million years, a whole range of new species replace the ones we know. Herds of giant grazing rats are stalked by saber-toothed predatory rats. Given enough time, will a species of intelligent, cultivated rats emerge? Will rodent historians and scientists eventually organize careful archaeological gnaws through the strata of our long compacted cities and reconstruct the peculiar and temporarily tragic circumstances that gave rat-kind its big break? Back only one rendezvous now to rendezvous 11, about 85 million years ago, where we greet a large contingent of pilgrims, the Lauratiathae pilgrims. This is a group of animals which has only recently been named as a result of molecular taxonomy, showing somewhat unexpectedly that carnivores, odd-toed ungulates, that's horses, even-toed ungulates like cattle, antelopes, pigs, and hippos, and shrews and bats and various other things are all united. The hippo's tale. When I was a schoolboy studying Greek, I learned that hippos meant horse and potamos, river. Hippopotamuses were river horses. Later, when I gave up Greek and read zoology, I was not too disconcerted to learn that hippopotamuses weren't close to horses after all. Instead, they were classified firmly with pigs in the middle of the even-toed ungulates or artiodactyls. I have now learned something so shocking that I'm still reluctant to believe it, but it looks as though I'm going to have to. Hippos' closest living relatives are whales. The even-toed ungulates include whales. Whales, needless to say, don't have hooves at all, whether odd or even-toed. Indeed, they don't have toes.
Whales are wonders of the world. They include the largest organisms that have ever moved. They swim with up and down movements of the spine derived from the mammalian gallop, as opposed to the side-to-side wave motion of the spine of a swimming fish or a running lizard or presumably a swimming ichthyosaur, which in other respects looked rather like a dolphin, except for the telltale vertical tail, where the dolphin's is horizontal, for galloping through the sea. The front limbs are used for steering and stabilizing. There are no externally visible hind limbs at all, but some whales have small vestigial pelvic and leg bones buried deep within their bodies.
It would not be too hard to believe that whales are closer cousins to even-toed ungulates than they are to any other mammals. A bit strange, perhaps, but not shocking to accept that some remote ancestor branched to the left and went to sea to give rise to the whales, while it branched to the right to give all the even-toed ungulates. What is shocking is that according to the molecular evidence, whales are deeply embedded within the even-toed ungulates. Hippos are closer cousins to whales than hippos are to anything else, including other even-toed ungulates, such as pigs.
Something happened in the history of the whales that made them flip into evolutionary overdrive. Their closest cousins, the hippos, remained relatively static as normal, respectable artiodactyls. The whales evolved so much faster than all the rest of the artiodactyls that their origin within that group was obscured until molecular taxonomists came along and uncovered it. So what is special about the history of the whales?
When you write it down like that, the solution leaps off the page. Leaving the land and becoming wholly aquatic was a bit like going into outer space. When we go into space, we are weightless. A whale floats. Unlike a seal or a turtle, which still comes on land to breed, a whale never stops floating. It never has to contend with gravity. A hippo spends time in the water, but it still needs stout tree trunk-like legs and strong leg muscles for the land. A whale doesn't need legs at all, and it doesn't have any. Think of a whale as what a hippo would like to be, if only it could be freed from the tyranny of gravity. And of course, there are so many other odd things about living the whole time in the sea that it comes to seem far less surprising that whale evolution should have spurted as it did, leaving hippos behind, stranded on land and stranded in the middle of the artiodactyls. Much the same thing happened in the other direction 300 million years earlier, when our fish ancestors emerged from the water onto the land. If whales are glorified hippos, we are all glorified lungfish. The emergence of legless whales from within the middle of the artiodactyls, leaving the rest of the artiodactyls behind, should not seem more surprising than the emergence of four-legged land animals from one particular group of fish, leaving those fish behind. That, at any rate, is how I rationalize the hippo-whale connection and recover my lost zoological composure. Zoological composure be blowed. My attention was drawn to the following while this book was in its final stages of preparation. In 1866, the great German zoologist Ernst Haeckel drew up a schematic evolutionary tree of mammals. I'd often seen the full tree reproduced in histories of zoology, but I'd never before noticed the position of the whales and hippos in Haeckel's scheme. Haeckel presciently placed the whales close to the artiodactyls, but the real stunner is where he put the hippos. He classified them by the unflattering name obesa, and he put them not in the artiodactyls, but as a tiny twig on the branch leading to the whales.
There is no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before us. Ecclesiastes 1, 9-10.
Back now to rendezvous 16, where we mammals are joined by most of the reptiles, the sauropsids, which include birds, which, as you know, are glorified dinosaurs. The elephant bird's tale. From the tales of the Arabian Nights, the image that most stirred my childish imagination was the roc encountered by Sinbad the sailor, who at first thought this monstrous bird was a cloud come over the sun.
I had heard aforetime of pilgrims and travellers, how in a certain island dwelleth a huge bird called the roc, which feedeth its young on elephants.
The legend of the roc, or ruck, surfaces in several stories of the Arabian Nights. It is mentioned by Marco Polo as living in Madagascar, and envoys from the king of Madagascar were said to have presented the Khan of Cathay with a roc feather. Michael Drayton invoked the monstrous bird's name to contrast it with the proverbially tiny wren.
All feathered things, yet ever known to men, from the huge ruck unto the little wren.
What is the origin of the roc legend? And if it is pure fantasy, whence the recurrent connection with Madagascar?
Fossils from Madagascar tell us that a gigantic bird, the elephant bird, Aepyornis maximus, lived there perhaps until as late as the 17th century, although more probably around 1000 AD. The elephant bird finally succumbed, perhaps partly through people stealing its eggs, which were up to 1 meter in circumference and would have provided as much food as 200 chicken eggs. The elephant bird was 3 meters tall and weighed nearly half a ton, as much as 5 ostriches. Unlike the legendary roc, which used its mighty wingspan to carry Sinbad aloft as well as elephants, the real elephant bird could not fly, and its wings were small, like an ostrich's. But although a cousin, it would be wrong to imagine it as a scaled-up ostrich. It was a more robust, heavy-set bird, a kind of feathered tank, with a big head and neck, unlike the ostrich's slender periscope. Given how legends readily grow and inflate, Aepyornis is a plausible progenitor for the roc.
The elephant bird was probably vegetarian, unlike earlier groups of giant carnivorous birds, such as the Forus rhacoid family of the New World. They could grow to the same height as Aepyornis with a fearsomely hooked beak, which, as if in justification of their nickname of feathered tyrannosaurs, looks capable of swallowing a medium-sized lawyer whole. These monstrous cranes seem at first sight better casting for the role of the terrifying roc than Aepyornis, but they went extinct too long ago to have started the legend, and in any case, Sinbad, or his real-life Arab counterparts, never visited the Americas.
The elephant bird of Madagascar is the heaviest bird known to have lived, but it was not the longest. Some species of moa could reach a height of 3.5 meters, but only if the neck was raised, as in one early museum mounting. In life, it seems, they normally carried the head only a little way above the back. But the moa cannot have generated the roc legend, for New Zealand, too, was well beyond Sinbad's ken. About 10 moa species existed in New Zealand, and they ranged in size from turkey to double-sized ostrich. Moas are extreme among flightless birds in that they have no trace of wings at all, not even buried vestiges of wing bones. They thrived in both the North and South Islands of New Zealand until the recent invasion by the Maori people, about 1250 AD. They were easy prey, no doubt for the same reason as the dodo. Except for the extinct Haast's eagle, the largest eagle ever to have lived, they'd known no predators for tens of millions of years, and the Maoris slaughtered them all, eating the choicer parts and discarding the rest, belying, not for the first time, the wishful myth of the noble savage living in respectful harmony of his environment. By the time the Europeans arrived, only a few centuries after the Maoris, the last moa was gone. Legends and tall stories of sightings persist to this day, but the hope is forlorn. In the words of a plaintive song to be sung in a mournful New Zealand accent.
No mower, no mower. In old Aotearoa, can't get 'em. They've et 'em. They've gone and there ain't no mower. The elephant bird's tale goes on after concluding that the elephant bird itself probably is the origin of the rock legend, to recount how molecular geneticists have managed to get DNA out of moa bones. Did I say moa? The elephant bird is probably the origin of the rock legend. The molecular geneticists have got DNA out of both elephant birds and moas, and compared them with other ratite birds like ostriches and emus and rheas, and this evidence has been used to provide, I use it at least to provide a good story about continental drift and plate tectonics. So the real end to the elephant bird's tale is the tale of plate tectonics and the drifting of the continents, which is one of the most riveting stories in all of geology. Now we move to rendezvous 26, about 590 million years ago, although it becomes increasingly difficult to put dates on these rendezvous so far back in time. Here we're joined by the protostomes, which is most of the invertebrate phyla. The barnacle's tale. When I was at boarding school, it was occasionally necessary to apologize to the housemaster for being late for dinner.
Sorry I'm late, sir. Orchestra practice.
Or whatever the excuse might be. On those occasions when there really was no good excuse and we had something to hide, we formed the habit of saying,
Sorry I'm late, sir. Barnacles.
He always nodded kindly, and I don't know whether he ever wondered what this mysterious out-of-school activity might be. It is possible that we were inspired by the example of Darwin, who devoted years of his life to barnacles so single-mindedly that his children were moved to ask in innocent puzzlement after being shown round the house of some friends,
Then where does your papa do his barnacles?
I'm not sure that we knew the Darwin story then, and I suspect that we invented the excuse because there is something about barnacles that seems too implausible to be a bluff. Barnacles are not what they seem. That applies to other animals too, and it's the theme of the barnacle's tale.
Contrary to all appearances, barnacles are crustaceans. The ordinary acorn barnacles, which encrust the rocks like miniature limpets, helping your shoes not to slip if you're wearing them, and hurting your feet if you aren't, are completely unlike limpets internally. Inside the shell, they are distorted shrimps, lying on their backs, kicking their legs in the air. Their feet bear feathery combs or baskets with which they filter particles of food out of the water. Goose barnacles do the same thing, but instead of sheltering under a conical shell like an acorn barnacle, they sit on the end of a stout stalk. They get their name from yet another misunderstanding of the true nature of barnacles. Their wet, filtering feathers give them the appearance of a baby bird in its egg. In the days when people believed in spontaneous generation, a folk belief grew that goose barnacles hatched into geese. Specifically, Brantoleucopsis, the barnacle goose.
Most deceptive of all, indeed probably holding the record for animals not looking remotely like the thing that zoologists know them to be, are the parasitic barnacles such as Saculina. Saculina is not what it seems with a vengeance. Zoologists would never have realized that it is in fact a barnacle but for its larva. The adult is a soft sac that clings to the underside of a crab and sends long, branching, plant-like roots inside to absorb nourishment from the crab's tissues. The parasite not only doesn't look like a barnacle, it doesn't look like a crustacean of any kind. It has completely lost all trace of the armor plating and all trace of the bodily segmentation that nearly all other arthropods have. It might as well be a parasitic plant or fungus. Yet, in terms of its evolutionary relationships, it is a crustacean, and not just a crustacean, but specifically a barnacle. By the way, Sacculina's branching root system is not indiscriminate in its invasion of the crab's tissues. It heads first for the crab's reproductive organs, which has the effect of castrating the crab. Is this just an accidental byproduct? Probably not. Castration not only sterilizes the crab, like a fat bullock, the castrated crab, instead of concentrating on becoming a lean, mean reproducing machine, diverts resources towards getting larger, more food for the parasite. We pass through all the remaining rendezvous points, past rendezvous 39, where we meet the bacteria, past Canterbury, which is the origin of life, to the final chapter of the book, the host's return. The genial host, having guided Chaucer and the other pilgrims from London to Canterbury and stood impresario to their tales, turned around and led them straight back to London. If I, having made the 4 billion-year pilgrimage to the dawn of life, now return to the present, it must be alone, for to presume upon evolution's following the same forward course twice would be to deny the rationale of our backward journey. Evolution was never aimed at a particular endpoint.
And yet, if to borrow a thought experiment of the American biologist Stuart Kauffman, evolution could be rerun again and again, maybe on an imaginary sample of Earth-like planets, how similar would the results be?
Like any zoologist, I can search my mental database of life on this planet and come up with an estimated answer to questions of the form, how many times has X evolved independently? The eye has evolved more than 40 times to 9 different designs. Echolocation, the trick of emitting sound pulses and navigating by accurate timing of the echoes, has evolved at least 4 times in bats, toothed whales, oilbirds, and cave swiftlets. Not as many times as the eye's tally of 40 to 60, but still often enough to make us suspect that, if the conditions are right, sonar will evolve.
To do the counts more systematically would make a good research project. What systems have evolved many times independently, like eyes, or several times, like echolocation? Have some things evolved only once, or not at all? I suspect that we'd find certain potential evolutionary pathways which life is eager to go down. Other pathways have more resistance.
Elsewhere, I developed the analogy of a huge museum of all life, both real and conceivable, with corridors going off in many mathematical dimensions to represent evolutionary change, both real and conceivable. The corridor of eyes is wide open, almost beckoning. Other corridors are blocked off by barriers that are hard or even impossible to surmount. Evolution repeatedly races down the easy corridors and just occasionally and unexpectedly leaps one of the hard barriers.
But how about things that have evolved only once or not at all? The wheel, with a true freely rotating bearing, seems to have evolved only once in bacteria before being finally invented in human technology. Language, too, has apparently evolved only in us, that is to say, at least 40 times less often than the eye. It is surprisingly hard to think of good ideas that have evolved only once.
I put the challenge to my Oxford colleague, the entomologist and naturalist George McGavin, and he came up with a nice list, but still a short one compared with the list of things that have evolved many times. Bombardier beetles of the genus Brachinus are unique in Dr. McGavin's experience in mixing chemicals to make an explosion. The ingredients are made and held in separate, obviously, glands. When danger threatens, they are squirted into a chamber near the rear end of the beetle, where they explode, forcing noxious, caustic, and boiling hot liquid out through a directed nozzle at the enemy. The case is well known to creationists, who love it. They think it is self-evidently impossible to evolve by gradual degrees, because the intermediate stages would all explode. I enjoyed demonstrating the error of this argument during my Royal Institution Christmas lectures for children shown on BBC television in 1991. Donning a Second World War helmet and inviting nervous members of the audience to leave, I mixed hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide, the two ingredients of the Bombardier explosion. Nothing happened. It didn't even get warm. The explosion requires a catalyst. I raised the concentration of catalyst gradually, which steadily increased the hot whoosh to a satisfactory climax. In nature, the beetle provides the catalyst and would have had no difficulty in gradually and safely increasing the dose over evolutionary time.
Next in the McGavin list is the archer fish, which may be unique in shooting a missile to knock prey down from a distance. Comes to the surface of the water and spits a mouthful at a perched insect, knocking it down into the water where it eats it. Spitting spiders are a bit different. Lacking the fleetness of a wolf spider or the net of a web spider, the spitting spider chucks a venomous glue some distance towards its prey, pinning it to the ground until the spider arrives and bites it to death. This is different from the archerfish technique of knocking prey down.
McGavin's next candidate for an evolutionary one-off is a beauty. It is the diving bell spider, Argyroneta aquatica. This spider lives and hunts entirely underwater, but like dolphins, dugongs, turtles, freshwater snails, and other land animals that have returned to water, it needs to breathe air. Unlike all those other exiles, Argyroneta constructs its own diving bell. It spins it of silk. Silk is the universal solution to any spider problem. Attached to an underwater plant. The spider goes to the surface to collect air, which it carries in the same way as some water bugs, in a layer trapped by body hairs. But unlike the bugs, which just carry the air like a scuba cylinder wherever they go, the spider takes it to its diving bell, where it unloads it to replenish the supply. The spider sits in the diving bell, watching for prey, and it stores and eats prey there once caught.
But George McGavin's champion example of a one-off is the larva of an African horsefly, Tabanus. Predictably, in Africa, the pools of water in which the larvae live and feed dry up. Each larva buries itself in the mud and pupates. The adult fly emerges from the baked mud and flies off to feed on blood, eventually to complete the cycle by laying eggs in pools of water when the rains return. The buried larva is vulnerable to a predictable danger. As mud dries out, it cracks, and there's a risk that a crack will tear right across the grub's refuge. It could theoretically save itself if it could somehow engineer a way for any crack that approaches it to be diverted around it instead. And it does indeed achieve this in a truly wonderful and probably unique manner. Before burying itself in its own pupation chamber, it first corkscrews its way down into the mud in a spiral. It then corkscrews its way back to the surface in an opposite spiral. Finally, it dives into the mud straight down the center between the two spirals, and that is its resting place through the bad times until water returns.
Now you see what this means. The larva is encased in a cylinder of mud whose circular boundary has been weakened in advance by the preliminary spiral burrowing. This means that when a crack snakes across the drying mud, if it hits the edge of the cylindrical column, instead of cutting straight across the middle, it goes instead in a curved bypass around the edge of the cylinder, and the larva is spared. It's just like the perforations around a stamp, which stop you tearing the stamp across. Dr. McGavin believes that this ingenious trick is literally unique to this one genus of horsefly.
This kind of comparative exercise, counting which things evolve often and which seldom, might help us to predict things about life outside this planet. Which features of life are parochial and which universal? This is a question that biologists ask less often than they should.
If, as returning host, I reflect on the whole pilgrimage of which I have been a grateful part, my overwhelming reaction is one of amazement. Amazement not only at the extravaganza of details that we've seen, amazement too at the very fact that there are any such details to be had at all on any planet. The universe could so easily have remained lifeless and simple, just physics and chemistry, just the scattered dust of the cosmic explosion that gave birth to time and space. The fact that it did not, the fact that life evolved out of nearly nothing, some 10 billion years after the universe evolved out of literally nothing, is a fact so staggering that I would be mad to attempt words to do it justice. And even that is not the end of the matter. Not only did evolution happen, it eventually led to beings capable of comprehending the process, and even of comprehending the process by which they comprehended. This pilgrimage has been a trip, not just in the literal sense, but in the countercultural sense I met when a young man in California in the 1960s. The most potent hallucinogen on sale in Haight or Ashbury or Telegraph Avenue would be tame by comparison. If it's amazement you want, the real world has it all. Not to stray outside the covers of this book, think of Venus's girdle, migrating jellyfish and tiny harpoons. Think of the platypus's radar and the electric fish, of the horsefly larva with the apparent foresight to preempt cracks in the mud. Think redwood, think peacock, think starfish with its piped hydraulic power. Think cichlid fish of Lake Victoria, evolving how many orders of magnitude faster than lingula, limulus, lungfish, or latimeria? It is not pride in my book, but reverence for life itself that encourages me to say, if you want a justification for the latter, open the former anywhere at random. And reflect on the fact that although this book has been written from a human point of view, another book could have been written in parallel for any of 10 million starting pilgrims. Not only is life on this planet amazing and deeply satisfying to all whose senses have not become dulled by familiarity, the very fact that we have evolved the brain power to understand our evolutionary genesis redoubles the amazement and compounds the satisfaction. Thank you very much.
We will take some questions now. Richard, why don't you repeat the questions so the people in the other room can hear?
I'll try.
Yeah, okay.
Why are there some species of life that seem to be very stable, like sharks, I think it's over 34 million years, and yet there are other species that evolve rather quickly?
Yeah. Why do some lineages in life evolve so incredibly slowly and stagnate for sometimes hundreds of millions of years, whereas others evolve incredibly quickly? These questions are discussed in two tales, the lungfish's tale, which is about the stagnation, and the cichlid fish's tale, and also the Galapagos finch's tale, about the extremely rapid evolution. It is a remarkable contrast between the different rates of evolution at which things can go. I incline to the view, not everybody does, but my tendency is to think that it's because natural selection isn't driving evolution fast in those lineages where it goes very, very slowly. Those creatures that evolve very slowly have found a very satisfactory way of life which doesn't demand, which doesn't push them into fast evolution. Others, like the cichlid fish, in the cichlid fish's tale, the cichlid fish of Lake Victoria, we know that Lake Victoria is only about 100,000 years old. That's a very, very young lake. And yet in that 100,000 years, one originating species has speciated into about 450 species in that short time of 100,000 years. It is a very remarkable fact. Thank you for calling it to our attention. I think the the answer may not be very satisfactory, but I think it's probably got to be different selection pressures. Yes?
Where along the line of evolution did the differentiation take place between male and female?
Where along the line of evolution did the differentiation take place between male and female? I think I'm right in saying that fossils won't help us there. We would have to look comparatively. And the differentiation between male and female is present in plants as well as animals. I suppose, I mean, it's not necessarily to be concluded that that means it goes back before the split between plants and animals, because plants and animals could have invented maleness and femaleness separately. I think it probably is extremely ancient. Sex itself is probably older still. Well, certainly older still in the sense of bacterial sex, which is a very different matter, where bacteria just do a bit of copy and paste or cut and paste from their genome to somebody else's genome. The sort of ritualized sex that we're familiar with, where exactly half of the genome of one partner is exchanged with half of the genome of the other, if we call that true sex, that goes back longer than the male-female divide, probably. Probably it originated under isogamous conditions. That means no difference between male and female, equal-sized gametes, where you had a medium-sized semi-egg fusing with another medium-sized semi-egg, and from that it would have divided by a kind of unstable runaway process, probably, into one gamete becoming larger and larger while the other one becomes smaller and smaller. And I think that story is probably a story of exploitation by one of the other. But as for when it happened, I don't know, but I would guess more than 1 billion years ago. Yes?
What do you think were the original replicating molecules, let's say prior to RNA? And then do you know of any experiments similar to the Miller experiment, perhaps, where people are trying to create replicating life or replicating molecules in the lab to prove that it can happen?
The question is about the origin of life and what the original replicating molecules were like before RNA. The speaker says before RNA rather than before DNA, very wisely, because almost certainly the first replicating molecule was not DNA. DNA is the dominant replicating molecule today. Replicating molecule is very important because that's the whole basis of natural selection. DNA is a high-tech replicator which demands elaborate copying machinery to make copies of itself. And the copying machinery that it demands includes its own products, protein and products of protein. So it can't have been DNA. RNA is a possibility because RNA is, although not a good enzyme, not a good catalyst like protein is, it's a kind of amateur enzyme, and it's also a kind of amateur replicator to compare with DNA as the professional replicator. And so one suggestion, the so-called RNA world suggestion, has been that RNA came first and it did both jobs, both the job that's now done by DNA and the job that's now done by protein. The questioner asks, though, what about before RNA? And I think he's probably wise to suggest that RNA was not the original one, although some people think it was. Some people, well, Graham Cairns Smith in Glasgow, for example, whose story I told in The Blind Watchmaker, suggested that it might even have been an inorganic molecule. Inorganic, he suggested, crystals of clay that was the original, crude self-replicator, which then gave rise to a takeover, possibly by RNA, and then finally a takeover by DNA. The questioner also asked whether there are any experiments similar to the Miller experiment. There are some, there are quite a few rather along the same lines. There are also some experiments done by chemists looking at molecules which behave as self-replicating entities and even which mutate and therefore form a kind of crude simulation of the origin of life, but the molecules that I'm thinking of clearly couldn't have been it. It's just that they are a kind of model system which shows the kind of thing which might have gone on in what I call Canterbury in the book, the origin of life. Yes.
In the selfish gene, you said that the evolution of subjective consciousness was the most profound mystery facing modern biology. And in the notes, you mentioned a couple theories, one of them by Daniel Dennett. That edition was published about 15 years ago, I think. In the time since then, do you have any further ideas on that, or are you aware of any current new theories about the evolution of subjective consciousness?
My answer to the question is going to be no, so it's hardly worth repeating it. But the question is, in The Selfish Gene, I referred to consciousness as the most profound mystery facing science. And in the second edition, I mentioned Daniel Dennett's work. Do I know of anything more recent than that? It's not a subject that I have any claim to understand at all. I'm still as baffled by it as I ever was. Daniel Dennett's book has the confident title, Consciousness Explained. And I recommend it strongly. I've read it twice. Once Lalla read it aloud to me, and that helped a great deal. But I still don't think I really know. I certainly don't know what the answer is, and I'm not sure I know what the question is as to what consciousness is. So I'm sorry, my answer is no, I don't have any. Yes.
Have you ever been nominated for the Templeton Prize?
The Templeton Prize, have I ever been nominated, the questioner says, for the Templeton Prize. The Templeton Prize is, what is it, $1 million? Which is offered to any scientist who's prepared to make a Faustian bargain with religion. It goes to scientists who are prepared to sell their souls. The previous questioner mentioned the name of Daniel Dennett. Daniel Dennett once said to me, "Richard, if ever you fall on hard times..." There was a lady here, I think, yes. Yeah.
A question I'm sure you do know something about. These teeny bones of humanoids that have been found in Indonesia as of late, are they like the living pygmies in Africa today, or what's their status?
The little bones, the bones of little people, or rather a little person, which has been found in Indonesia on the island of Flores, are they similar to modern pygmies, the questioner asks. No, not similar to modern pygmies. This has been classified by its discoverers as Homo floresiensis. They've classified it as a different species of our genus Homo. They think that it comes from Homo erectus, which somehow got onto the island of Flores, and there, as so often happens when animals get onto islands, it got very much smaller. So it's about 3 feet tall. The reason it's not like a pygmy is that the brain is much too small for its size. Pygmies have brains which are proportionately large for their size, like any other human does. Homo floresiensis does not. It's completely different in that respect, and that's why they've given it a separate species name. There is some doubt, I think, or some doubt, I suspect, is going to come to the surface as to whether this really is a separate species. Since only one specimen has been found in any quantity of bones, there's the odd tooth from other individuals, it could very well be, according to some anthropologists, a freak genetic mutant, a genetic mutant of Homo sapiens. It has been found with stone tools, which suggest to the authors that it was technologically sophisticated, but equally it could have been a member of a Homo sapiens group, but it was a genetic mutant and so was extremely small and had a disproportionately small brain. It's very recent. It died only 18,000 years ago, which is so recent that one feels we only just missed meeting it, and there's a sort of hope that if this is a separate species, they might even still be around, although I think it's rather a forlorn hope. But a more likely possibility is, because it's so recent, it should be possible to get DNA from it. And my colleague Alan Cooper, who was the one who did the work on the elephant bird DNA and the moa DNA, Alan Cooper is hoping and indeed expecting to get permission to take DNA from these bones. And that would settle once and for all whether it is Homo sapiens, which would be very disappointing, or whether it's something completely different, in which case it would be very, very exciting indeed. Yes, there, yes.
You're the person that makes the genetic replicator most, clear in my mind, but the complex machinery required for genetic also leads me to ask what you think of mimetics and that theory that once an organism can mimic, then there can be a second replicator in a good idea.
The question is about mimetics and the analogy with genetics. Once an organism has become complex enough to mimic, then can there be a second kind of sort of pseudogenetics and a second kind of Darwinian evolution? Well, I think it's an interesting possibility which is well worth pursuing, and various people are pursuing it and have pursued it. When I originally proposed the idea of memes, it was not actually supposed to be a contribution to the study of cultural evolution. It was supposed rather to be a lesson that although the whole of the rest of the book, The Selfish Gene, had been about genes, Darwinism does not actually have to be about genes. Anything self-replicating will do. And if there'd been computer viruses around in 1975, I would probably have talked about computer viruses at that point. As it was, I talked about memes, which are things like fashions and tunes, which you whistle and other people copy you and whistle them, or fashions in walking, accents in talking, all the things that we may or may not we may mimic from each other. If you've got faithful mimicry, faithful imitation, then there is the possibility that the thing mimicked could behave like a gene and could pass through the population as an epidemic, like a measles epidemic, or could pass down through the generations as children mimic their parents. And I think that's obviously a theoretical possibility worth taking seriously, and if it's wrong, then it's wrong, and it needs to be shown to be wrong. But I think it is a serious and interesting possibility. It's gone a little bit over the top in some internet sites. If you look up memetics on the internet, you'll find a great deal of stuff. Somewhat variable. I think I once discovered that memetics has been turned into a religion, with me as Saint Dawkins. Yes, up there.
It seems that every time a new discovery of hominid fossils is made, it becomes a new species. You give it a new name, all this. Is that, you think, how much of that do you think is legitimate? How much of that do you think is driven by the need to publish or perish, by funding? And at what point are we going to find out that maybe there's only 3 or 4 actual ancestral species, not 20?
Right. Whenever a new hominid fossil is discovered, there's a temptation to give it a new species name. And how much is that real, and how much is it driven by... Well, I mean, paleoanthropologists are only human, and I guess there is enormous prestige in discovering a new species, and in particularly if you can claim it's older than other people's and closer to the line leading to us than other people's. So it is a field in which there is a great deal of rivalry and even, I'm sorry to say, bad feeling. But in all, the whole field of taxonomy is riven with what Steve Gould called names and nastiness. It is a somewhat spiteful field, I think. There are rivalries. And there are lumpers and splitters in all branches of taxonomy, people who like to coin a new name for every specimen found. They're the splitters, and the lumpers who push everything in together. I don't feel enough of a specialist in hominid taxonomy to say whether I think that some particular specimen ought to be called this species or that. So I don't think I'm the right person to ask, but the questioner is absolutely right to point to the problem. Yes.
As somebody who's spent a lot of time popularizing science to the lay public, do you have any comments about the competition between science and pseudoscience in our culture, and what can happen to a culture that doesn't teach science to people?
The question is about the competition between science and pseudoscience in our culture. In the competition for propagating ideas, those that are the most attractive, I suppose, in some sense, spread. What surprises me is that pseudoscience appears to some people to be attractive. I should have thought that real science should be winning hands down in the competition against pseudoscience for spreadability, for mimetic spreadability, if you want to put it that way. So I'm somewhat baffled. I mean, it's possible that we scientists are not doing a good job of selling science. I think there is an appetite for wonder, and the appetite for wonder may be being fed by pseudoscience because we're not doing a sufficiently good job of showing that real science is actually a far more nutritious way of filling that need. Obviously, I'm doing my best to do that, and so are other people. And I suppose I want to encourage other scientists, I'm sure there are lots of scientists here, encourage scientists to go out there and sell your science as exciting and wondrous. One possible educational solution is to, this is an analogy which I think Lalla originally suggested to me, the analogy with musical appreciation and playing music. A great deal of science education, a great deal of what many people remember from science classes at school is learning how to use a Bunsen burner. And it's important that there should be people in the world who know how to do science in practice. We do need scientists, and they've got to know how to do it, starting with Bunsen burners and working up. But just as you can appreciate music at a pretty high level without ever learning to play a note on any instrument, so you should be able to appreciate great science just as you can appreciate great music without having to play the Bunsen burner any more than you have to play the violin. So, I mean, that's a suggestion for educational policy, that we might have more education in science appreciation, which means you can talk about galaxies and dinosaurs and geological time and all sorts of wonderful things. And other people can be studying the Bunsen burner as well, but let's increase the wonder of science and take wonder away from its usurpation by pseudoscience, and I would add by religion. Yes.
Is selection possible at the group level?
Is selection possible at a group level? It is possible, but in my view, not evolutionarily important. There's an awful lot of confusion in the literature because all sorts of different things tend to get talked about under the heading of group selection. But I think I don't need to talk about them because I don't think any of them are evolutionarily important. That's not a logical necessity, but I think that in practice, if you look at natural selection, particularly if you ask the question, could this thing that you're looking at be an adaptation to stop the group going extinct? Then the answer is almost every time no. You will find in the literature cases which are called group selection, which certainly work, but they're not group selection. They're often something else like kin selection or reciprocal altruism, which are well understood in the orthodox mainstream Darwinian theory. There are some people who prefer to discuss them under the heading of group selection. I think that's downright confusing, but if they find it clearer, as apparently some people do, then they're welcome to it. I prefer to stick to talking of natural selection at the level of self-replicating entities, the things that become either more numerous or less numerous in a population, and the vehicles that carry them about. Self-replicating entities are nearly always DNA. Vehicles that carry them about are nearly always individual organisms. Arguably, they might be groups under some very special circumstances. Yes, yes, over there.
Mine is not a question, but a comment of what you said earlier about science and pseudoscience. My wonder of science came about with people like you, Sagan, Asimov. I'm wondering if that's what we should be putting out in the schools for the children to read, so they would become interested in science like I do.
This is not a question, but a comment. Books like those of Carl Sagan and Isaac Asimov, and the question was kind enough to add my own, should be put out in the schools in science classes. I can only agree. Yes. Yes.
In the United States, we seem to be having to deal with a lot of people called creationists or intelligent design people. Is there anything similar to that in Europe, and does these groupings have any political impact comparable to here?
Well, I think you put the question is about creationists and people like that, and the problem of America being plagued by these people at the moment. The question is, does the same thing happen in Europe, and do they have political influence? I think you put your finger on it. They do exist. I can't speak for Europe, but in Britain they do exist. Creationists and other sorts of religious nuts do exist. The difference is we don't vote them into power. Yes.
Can you see genetic engineering having an impact on human evolution?
Can I see genetic engineering having an impact on human evolution? Well, potentially, yes. This is a matter for what we decide to do with it. The technology is beginning to become available, and it's going to increase. And if some either mad dictator or not so mad dictator, I don't know, in the future wanted to engineer a race of humans that had some particular characteristics, I'm sure it's going to become possible. And if we're worried about that, now's the time to start thinking about it and start working out how we're going to control it. One thing I would say about that is that long before genetic engineering became possible, that's to say artificial mutation, artificially changing the mutational side of the Darwinian equation became possible, it has for thousands of years been possible and actually practiced to manipulate the selection part of the Darwinian equation. So we've already for thousands of years been selecting wolves to turn them into Pekingeses, and we've been making potatoes and tomatoes and maize cobs and horses and cows and pigs very, very different from their wild ancestors by artificial selection of domestic animals and plants, but we haven't done it to ourselves. Now, before we get too hot under the collar about the possibilities of genetic manipulation of mutation of humans, perhaps we could realize that we could, at any time in the last many centuries, have done the same thing and bred the human equivalent of Pekingeses. But since we haven't done that, it doesn't look as though we are particularly eager as a species to manipulate our own evolution. Of course, that may all change, but at present, I think that's perhaps a slightly consoling thought. There, yes.
Yes, sir. The intelligent design proponents seem to have rested their case on this idea of irreducible complexity. And you touched on it when you talked about the bombardier beetle as having been one of their favorites. It seems like in every case, we've got to show how the complexity is reducible. Is there some kind of meta-argument that really undermines this idea of irreducible complexity?
The intelligent design people have a phrase called irreducible complexity, which, by the way, is not new. I mean, the phrase may be new, but it's precisely the argument that Darwin answered and refuted. The questioner says, it seems as though we have to take every individual case that they throw at us on its own and answer that one and show how this one is actually reducible. Is there not some kind of meta-argument, he asks, that enables us to answer them all in one go without taking them individually? Well, I think there is a meta-argument. However, it may not be likely to appeal to the sorts of audiences that listen to that kind of person, because they will see it as a straight challenge which was evaded by the evolutionist. I think the meta-argument would go something like this. It doesn't depend upon whether you or I have the ingenuity or the knowledge to dream up a particular explanation for how this particular putative example of irreducible complexity might be reduced. That's to say, how this particular, for example, I was thrown one the other day on the radio about bats and how the bat wing could have evolved. The implication is that if I can't answer this particular question about bats, the case is lost. Evolution is down the drain. Whereas I think the right answer, which, as you say, is a meta-argument, is it isn't up to me to exercise my own ingenuity in trying to dream up what might almost be called a just-so story for how this particular example, bat wings or whatever it is, might have evolved. Because I don't know everything. I know nothing about bats. You probably don't know anything about bats. If there's somebody here who knows about bats, then they'll probably enlighten us. But if they don't, too bad. We're not testing human ingenuity here. We have a large edifice of theory which works. And whenever anybody looks sufficiently carefully at something, it always yields to explanation. But as I said, that's not the kind of way to win a public debate with whatever those people are called. Eugene P. Gish or whatever his name is. Yeah. Yes, in the hat.
Yeah. In your opinion, how much of human behavior is genetically controlled or influenced, highly influenced? What's your feeling on that?
63.7%. The question is how much of human behavior is genetically controlled. You know I can't answer that question.
What do you feel?
As Carl Sagan said when asked, "What's your gut feeling?" he said, "But I try not to think with my gut." No. There are so many ways of expressing what you mean by that. Probably the least confusing way is to say, take the variance in a particular in a population. It might be in this lecture hall. Take the variance in some particular characteristic, like height or weight or musical ability, and draw a bell curve of the total variance, the total ranging from brilliant musical ability to total tone deafness and with a peak in the middle. So there you have your total variance. And then you partition that variance using the well-known statistical technique of analysis of variance. You partition the variance into various components. You subdivide by education, by training, by nutrition, and by genetics. And so the proportion of the variation which you can associate with genetic variation is the answer you want. But of course, that proportion depends upon what the particular set of people that we have here as a population. If you take this brilliant and highly educated audience at Caltech, you will have a different starting population from which you're then going to take the proportion which is genetic than if you were to take the entire population of the United States, including the red states. Whereupon, obviously, well, you get the point. I mean, it's not a question that can be given or deserves to be given a simple numerical answer. Yes, at the back.
Hi, Dr. Dawkins. Related to that, what's your thoughts on sociobiology? It's the idea that our social behaviors, most notably the difference between sexes but others, are very biologically, if not genetically, explained.
The question is, what's my opinion of sociobiology, in particular the suggestion that differences between the sexes are genetically determined. I mean, sociobiology was defined by Wilson, who coined the term, as something like the scientific study of social behavior of all animal species, something like that. Now that's a neutral definition. That does not presuppose any doctrine, or in particular, it doesn't presuppose any answer to the question you've asked about the contribution of genes to the differences between the sexes. Sociobiological research in particular cases may find answers, but that's not to be identified with sociobiology per se. There are people who think it is identified with sociobiology per se because they think the word biology imported into sociology implies what they call genetic determinism, and therefore all sorts of bad things like women should be chained to the kitchen sink and things. But that's not inherent in the definition of sociobiology. Sociobiology was of course controversial for various reasons, mostly the last chapter about humans. And I think it was partly a territorial dispute of existing social scientists, sociologists and anthropologists and so on, fearing a takeover bid by biology. And I must say, Wilson, in his choice of language, could have been slightly more circumspect and tactful. There were times when it looked a bit like a takeover bid. Not many people nowadays call themselves sociobiologists. They changed their name. They metamorphosed as a sort of defensive adaptation into behavioral ecologists, and then most recently into evolutionary psychologists. There were sort of minor, nuanced differences along the way. I'm proud to call myself all three. I'm a sociobiologist and a behavioral ecologist and an evolutionary psychologist. And thank you very much.